35. The Plan. All day long we ate up the road through Montana. It hadn't looked so far on the map, but it was all mountains. We started in the foothills of the Rockies as we left Yellowstone, and all day we climbed up and down. Sometimes the road snaked along the side of a cliff, and the only thing between us and the sharp drop was a piddly railing. Often, as we sailed around a bend, we came face to face with a camping trailer swinging its wide body around the curve. "These roads are a dinger," Gramps said, but he was like a little kid riding a hobby horse. "Giddy up, let's get a move on," he said, encouraging the car up a hill. "Hee-yah!" he said, as we swept down the other side. I felt as if I was torn in two pieces. Half of me was ogling the scenery. I had to admit that it was as pretty as, maybe even prettier than, Bybanks. Trees and rocks and mountains, rivers and flowers, deer and moose and rabbits. It was an amazing country, an enormous country. But the other half of me was a quivering pile of jelly. I could see our car bursting through the railing and plunging down the cliff. As we approached each curve, I could see us smashing straight on into a truck or a camper. Every time I saw a bus, I watched it sway. I watched its tires spin dangerously close to the gravel at the road's edge. I watched it plunge on, eating up the road, defying those curves. Gram sat quietly, with her hands folded on her lap. I thought she might sleep, especially after staying awake all night, but she didn't. She wanted to hear about Phoebe. So all day long, as I took in the scenery, and as I imagined us in 1,000 accidents, and as I prayed underneath it all to any tree whizzing by, I talked about Phoebe. I wanted to tell it all today. I wanted to finish it. On the day after Mr. Berkway appeared at Phoebe's house and told us about Mr. Cadaver, Phoebe and I put our plan in motion. We were going to track down Sergeant Bickle's son and, according to Phoebe, discover the whereabouts of Phoebe's mother. I wasn't positive that Sergeant Bickle's son was a lunatic, and I wasn't convinced he would lead us to Phoebe's mother, but enough of Phoebe's tales had been transplanted into my brain so that I was caught up in the plan. Like Phoebe, I was ready to take some action. We could hardly sit still all day at school. Phoebe especially was fired up. She was worried, too. She was afraid we might not discover her mother alive, and I was beginning to share that fear. At school, everyone was still buzzing about the journal readings. Everyone wanted to know who had written about the murder. Alex avoided Mary Lou because of what she had said about his being a pink jerk, and Mary Lou avoided Beth Ann because of what Beth Ann had written about the chicken kisses. Megan and Christy taunted Beth Ann with, "Did you really tell Mary Lou that kisses taste like chicken? Did she really believe you?" And they taunted me with, "Do you really kiss trees? Didn't you know you're supposed to kiss boys?" In English class, everyone badgered Mr. Berkway to finish reading the journal entry that he had begun yesterday, the one about Mrs. Corpse and the body, but Mr. Berkway did not read any more journals. Instead, he apologized for hurting people's feelings by reading their private thoughts aloud, and he sent us to the library. There, Ben trailed me. If I looked at the fiction section, he was right beside me. If I moved over to examine the magazines, there he was, flipping through one as well. Once his face made contact with my shoulder. He was definitely trying to plant a kiss on me. I knew he was, but there was nothing I could do about it. I could not help it that whenever he aimed his mouth in my direction, my body was already moving away. I needed a little warning. I tried remaining completely still for several consecutive minutes, and during those minutes, I detected Ben leaning slightly toward me several times. Each time, however, he drew back, as if someone were controlling him by an invisible thread. Across the library, Beth Ann called, "Sal, there's a spider! Oh, Sal, kill it!" When the final bell rang, Phoebe and I were out of school like a shot. At Phoebe's house, we examined the telephone directory. "We've got to hurry," Phoebe said, "before Prudence or my father comes home." There were 6 Bickles listed in the directory. We took turns calling. Each time we asked for Sergeant Bickle. The first two people said we must have the wrong number. The third number we dialed was busy. The fourth, no answer. The fifth was answered by a crotchety woman who said, "I don't know any sergeants." The sixth number was answered by an elderly man who must have been lonely, because he talked on and on about once knowing a Sergeant Freeman in the war, but that was back in 1944, and he also knew a Sergeant Bones and a Sergeant Dowdy, but he did not know a Sergeant Bickle. "What are we going to do?" Phoebe wailed. "Prudence will be home any minute, and we still don't know which is the right Bickle." The busy number was still busy. The previously unanswered one rang and rang, and just as Phoebe was about to hang up, she heard a voice. "Hello?" she said. "May I speak with Sergeant Bickle, please?" There was a pause as she listened. "He's still at work?" Phoebe was jumping up and down. "Thank you," she said, trying to make her voice serious. "I'll call later. No message. Thank you." "Yes," she said when she hung up. "Yes, yes, yes!" She was hugging me half to death. "You'll have to do phase 2, tonight." That night, while my father was at Margaret's, I phoned the Bickles. I prayed that Sergeant Bickle wouldn't answer, but I was prepared to disguise my voice in case he did. The phone rang and rang. I hung up. I rehearsed my voice and what I would say. I tried again. On the 7th ring, the phone was answered. It was Sergeant Bickle. "My name is Susan Longfellow," I said. "I am a friend of your son's. I was wondering if I might speak with him." I prayed and prayed that he had only one son. "He isn't here," Sergeant Bickle said. "Would you like to leave a message?" "Do you know when he'll be home?" There was a pause. "How did you say you know my son?" This made me nervous. "How do I know your son? Well, that's a long story. Basically, the way I know him is, actually, this is a little embarrassing to admit." My hands were sweating so much I could hardly hang on to the phone. "The library. Yes, I know him from the library, and he loaned me a book, but I've lost the book." "Maybe you should explain this all to him," Sergeant Bickle said. "Yes, maybe I should do that." "I wonder why he gave you this phone number," he said. "I wonder why he didn't give you his number at school." "At school? Actually, the thing is, I think he did give me that number too, but I've lost it." "You sure lose a lot of things," he said. "Would you like his number at school?" "Yes," I said. "Or better yet, maybe you could give me his address and I'll just send him the book." "I thought you said you lost the book." "Actually, yes, but I'm hoping to find it," I said. "I see," he said. "Just a minute." There was a muffled pause as he put his hand over the receiver and called, "Honey, where's Mike's address?" Mike. Brilliant. A name. I felt like the chief inspector. I felt like I had just discovered the most important clue in the criminal investigation of the century. To top it off, Sergeant Bickle gave me Mike's address. I was sorely tempted to end the conversation by informing Sergeant Bickle that his son was a potential lunatic, but I refrained. I thanked him and immediately phoned Phoebe. "You're brilliant," she said. "Tomorrow we'll nail Mike the lunatic." Chapter 36. The Visit. The next day, Saturday, when Phoebe and I reached the bus stop, Ben was standing there. "Oh, crud," Phoebe muttered. "Are you waiting for this bus? Are you going to Chanting Falls?" "Yep," he said. "To the university?" "Nope." Ben pushed his hair from his eyes. "There's a hospital there. I'm going to see someone." "So you're taking this bus?" Phoebe said. "Yes, Phoebe, I am taking this bus. Do you mind?" The three of us sat on the long bench at the back of the bus. I was in between Phoebe and Ben, and his arm pressed up against mine. Phoebe said we were visiting an old friend at the university. Each time we rounded a curve, Ben leaned against me or I leaned against him. "Sorry," he said. "Sorry," I said. At Chanting Falls, we stood on the pavement as the bus roared off. "The university's over there," Ben pointed down the road. "See ya." And he walked off in the other direction. "Oh, Lord," Phoebe said. "Why did Ben have to be on the same bus? It made me very nervous." It made me nervous, too, but for different reasons. Every time I was with him now, my skin tickled and my brain buzzed, and my blood romped around as if it were percolating. The address we had for Mike Bickle was a freshman dormitory. It was a 3-story brick building with hundreds of windows. "Oh, no!" Phoebe wailed. "I thought it might be a little house or something." Students were coming in and out of the building and walking across the lawn. Some were sitting on the grass or benches studying. In the lobby was a reception desk with a handsome young man standing behind it. "You do it," Phoebe said. "I just can't." We stood out like pickles in a pea patch. There were all these grown-up college students, and here we were, 2 puny 13-year-old girls. Phoebe said, "I wish I had worn something else." She picked lint off her sweater. I explained to the man at the desk that I was looking for my cousin, Mike Bickle. The young man smiled a wide, white smile at me. He checked a roster and said, "You're in the right place. Room 209. You can go on up." Phoebe nearly choked. "You mean we could go right up to his room?" "Sure," the young man said. "Through there." We walked through swinging doors. Phoebe said, "Really? I'm having a heart attack. I know it. I can't do this. Let's get out of here." At the end of the hall, we slipped out the exit. What if we knocked on his door, and he opened it and pulled us inside and slit our throats? Students were milling around on the lawn. I looked for an empty bench on which we might sit. On the far side of the lawn, I saw the backs of 2 people, a young man and an older woman. They were holding hands. She turned to him and kissed his cheek. "Phoebe." On the bench was Phoebe's mother, and she was kissing the lunatic. Chapter 37. A Kiss. Phoebe was stunned and angry, but she was braver than I was. She could watch, but I could not. I assumed that Phoebe would follow me, but I didn't look back. Down the street I tore, trying to remember where the bus stop was. It wasn't until I saw the hospital that I realized I must have missed the bus stop. I ducked inside and was surprised that Phoebe was not behind me. What I did next was an impulse, a hunch. I asked the hospital receptionist if I could see Mrs. Finney. She flipped through a roster. "Are you a family member?" she said. "No." "I'm afraid you can't go up then," she said. "Mrs. Finney is on the psychiatric ward, family only." "I was looking for her son. He came here to visit her." "Maybe they went outside. You could look out back." Behind the hospital was a wide, sloping lawn bordered by flower gardens. Scattered across the lawn were benches and chairs, most of them occupied with patients and their visitors. It was a scene much like the one I had just left at the university, except here no one was studying, and some of the people wore dressing gowns. Ben was sitting cross-legged on the ground in front of a woman in a pink robe. She fidgeted with the sash. Ben saw me and stood up as I crossed the lawn. "This is my mother," he said. I said hello, but she didn't look at me. Instead, she stood and drifted off across the lawn as if we were not there. Ben and I followed. She reminded me so much of my mother after she returned from the hospital. My mother would stop right in the middle of doing something inside the house and walk out the door. Halfway up the hill, she would sit down to catch her breath. She picked at the grass, got up again, and went a little farther. Sometimes my mother went in the barn and filled the pail with chicken feed, but before she reached the chicken coop, she set the pail down and moved off in another direction. When she could walk farther, my mother rambled over the fields and the meadows in a weaving, snaking pattern, as if she could not make up her mind which way to turn. We followed Ben's mother back and forth across the lawn, but she never seemed to notice our presence. At last I said I had to go, and that's when it happened. For one quick moment, we both had the same agenda. I looked at him, and he looked at me. Both of our heads moved forward. It must have been in slow motion, because I had a split second there to be reminded of Mr. Berkway's drawing of the 2 heads facing each other, with the vase in between. I wondered, just for an instant, if a vase could fit between us. If there had been a vase, we would have squashed it because our heads moved completely together and our lips landed in the right place, which was on the other person's lips. It was a real kiss, and it did not taste like chicken. And then our heads moved slowly backward, and we stared out across the lawn, and I felt like the newly born horse who knows nothing but feels everything. Ben touched his lips. "Did it taste a little like blackberries to you?" he said. Chapter 38. Spit. At this point in my story, Graham interrupted. "Oh, yes, yes, yes," she said. "I have been waiting for that kiss for days. I do like a story with some good kisses in it." "She's such a gooseberry," Gramps said. We were churning through Montana. I didn't dare check our progress on the map. I didn't want to discover that we couldn't make it in time. I thought that if I kept talking and praying underneath, and if we kept moving along these mountainous roads, we had a chance. Graham said, "But what about Phoebe? What about her mother kissing the lunatic? I didn't like that kiss very much. It was the other one I liked, the one with Ben." I found Phoebe at the bus stop, sitting on the bench. "Where were you?" she asked. I did not tell her about seeing Ben or his mother. I wanted to, but I couldn't. "I was afraid, Phoebe. I couldn't stay there." "And I thought you were the brave one," she said. "Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. I'm sick of it." "What happened?" "Nothing. They sat there on the bench having a gay old time. If I could toss rocks like you can toss rocks, I'd have plonked them both on the back of the head. Did you notice her hair? She's cut it. It's short. And did you know what else she did? In the middle of talking, she leaned over and spit on the grass. Spit! It was disgusting. And the lunatic, do you know what he did when she spit? He laughed. Then he leaned over and he spit. Why would they do that? Who knows? I'm sick of it. My mother can stay there for all I care. She doesn't need me. She doesn't need any of us." Phoebe was like that all the way home on the bus. She was in an extensively black mood. We got to Phoebe's house just as her father pulled in the driveway. Prudence rushed out of the house saying, "She called! She called! She called! Mom called! She's coming home!" "Terrific," Phoebe muttered. "What was that, Phoebe?" her father said. "Nothing." "She's coming tomorrow," Prudence said. "But—" "What's wrong?" her father said. "What else did she say?" "She sounded nervous. She wanted to talk with you." "Did she leave a number? I'll call her back." "No, she didn't leave any number. She said to tell you not to make any prejudgments." "What is that supposed to mean?" her father said. "Not make any prejudgments about what?" "I don't know," Prudence said. "And most important, she said that she was bringing someone with her." "That's just grand," Phoebe said. "Just grand." "Phoebe," her father said. "Prudence, did she say who she's bringing?" "I honestly could not say." "Did she refer to this person at all? Did she mention a name?" He was getting agitated. "Why, no," Prudence said. "She didn't mention a name. She just said she was bringing him with her." "Him?" Phoebe looked at me. "Cripes," she said, and she went into the house, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't believe it. Wasn't she going to tell her father what she had seen? I was bursting at the seams to tell my own father, but when I got home, he and Margaret were sitting on the porch. Margaret said, "My brother told me you're in his English class. What a surprise!" She must have already told my father this because he didn't look too surprised. "He's a terrific teacher. Do you like him?" "I suppose." I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted Margaret to vanish. I had to wait until she went home to tell my father about Phoebe's mother, and when I did tell him, all he said was, "So Mrs. Winterbottom is coming home. That's good." He went over to the window and stared out of it for the longest time, and I knew he was thinking about my mother. All that night I thought about Phoebe and Prudence and Mr. Winterbottom. It seemed like their whole world was going to fall apart the next day when Mrs. Winterbottom walked in, all cuddly with the lunatic. Chapter 39. Homecoming. The next morning, Phoebe phoned, begging me to come over. "I can't stand it," she said. "I want a witness." "For what?" "I just want a witness." "Did you tell your father about your mother and—" "Are you kidding?" Phoebe said. "You should see him. He and Prudence spent all last night and this morning cleaning the house. They scrubbed the floors and bathrooms. They dusted like fiends. They did laundry and ironing, and they vacuumed. Then they got to look around. My father said, 'Maybe it looks too good. Your mother will think we can function without her.' So they messed things up. He's very put out with me that I wouldn't help." I did not want to be a witness to anything, but I felt guilty for running away the day before, and so I agreed. When I got to her house, Phoebe, Mr. Winterbottom, and Prudence were sitting there staring at each other. "Didn't she say what time she was coming?" Mr. Winterbottom asked. Prudence said, "No, she did not, and I wish you would quit acting as if it is my fault that she did not say more than she did." Mr. Winterbottom was a wreck. He jumped up to straighten a pillow, sat back down, and then he leaped up to mess up the pillow again. He went out in the yard and walked around in circles. He changed his shirt twice. "I hope you don't mind that I'm here," I said. "Why would I mind?" Mr. Winterbottom said. Just as I thought they would all go stark raving mad, a taxi pulled up outside. "I can't look," Mr. Winterbottom said, escaping to the kitchen. "I can't look either," Phoebe said. She followed her father, and I followed Phoebe. "Well, gosh," Prudence said. "I don't know what has gotten into everybody. Aren't you excited to see her?" From the kitchen, we heard Prudence open the front door. We heard Mrs. Winterbottom say, "Oh, sweetie." Mr. Winterbottom wiped the kitchen counter. We heard Prudence gasp and her mother say, "I'd like you to meet Mike." "Mike?" Mr. Winterbottom said. He was quite red in the face. I was glad there was no axe in the house, or I am fairly certain he would have picked it up and headed straight for Mike. Phoebe said, "Now, Dad, don't do anything too rash." "Mike?" he repeated. Mrs. Winterbottom called, "George, Phoebe." We heard her say to Prudence, "Where are they? Didn't you tell them we were coming?" Mr. Winterbottom took a deep breath. "Phoebe, I'm not sure you or Sal should be around for this." "Are you kidding?" Phoebe said. He took another deep breath. "Okay," he said, "okay. Here we go." He stood straight and tall and walked through to the living room. Phoebe and I followed. Honest and truly, I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away on the carpet. There were two reasons for this. The first one was that Mrs. Winterbottom looked different. Her hair was not only short, but also quite stylish. She was wearing lipstick, mascara, and a little blush on her cheeks, and her clothes were altogether unlike anything I had ever seen her in. A white t-shirt, blue jeans, and flat black shoes. Dangling from her ears were thin silver hoop earrings. She looked magnificent, but she did not look like Phoebe's mother. The second reason that I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away was that there was Mike Bickle, Phoebe's potential lunatic, in her own living room. It was one thing to think he was coming, and another thing to actually see him standing there. I didn't know what to think. For a second, I thought maybe Mike had kidnapped Mrs. Winterbottom and was bringing her back for some ransom money, or maybe he was now going to do away with the rest of us. But I kept thinking of seeing them together the day before, and besides, Mrs. Winterbottom looked too terrific to have been held captive. She did look frightened, but not of Mike. She seemed afraid of her husband. "Dad," Phoebe whispered, "that's the lunatic." "Oh, Phoebe," her mother said, pressing her fingers to her cheek, and when she made that familiar gesture, Phoebe looked as if her heart was splitting into 1,000 pieces. Mrs. Winterbottom hugged Phoebe, but Phoebe did not hug her back. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Norma, I hope you are going to explain exactly what is going on here." He was trying to make his voice firm, but it trembled. Prudence stared at Mike. She seemed to find him handsome and was flirting with him. She fluffed her hair away from her neck. Mrs. Winterbottom tried to put her arms around Mr. Winterbottom, but he pulled away. "I think we deserve an explanation," he said. He, too, stared at Mike. Was she in love with Mike? He seemed awfully young, not much older than Prudence. Mrs. Winterbottom sat down on the sofa and began to cry. It was a terrible moment. It was hard to make any sense out of what she said at first. She was talking about being respectable and how maybe Mr. Winterbottom would never forgive her, but she was tired of being so respectable. She had tried very hard all these years to be perfect, but she had to admit that she was quite unperfect. She said there was something that she had never told her husband, and she feared he would not forgive her for it. Mr. Winterbottom's hands trembled. He did not say anything. Mrs. Winterbottom motioned for Mike to join her on the sofa. Mr. Winterbottom cleared his throat several times, but still he said nothing. Mrs. Winterbottom said, "Mike is my son." Mr. Winterbottom, Prudence, Phoebe, and I all said, "Your son?" Mrs. Winterbottom stared at her husband. "George, I know you will think I am not, or was not, respectable, but it was before I met you, and I had to give him up for adoption, and I could barely bear to think of it, and—" Mr. Winterbottom said, "Respectable? Respectable? The hell with respectable!" Mr. Winterbottom did not normally swear. Mrs. Winterbottom stood up. "Mike found me. And at first I was frightened of what that would mean. I've lived such a tiny life." Phoebe took her father's hand. "And I had to go away and sort things out. I haven't yet met Mike's adoptive parents, but Mike and I have spent a lot of time talking, and I've been thinking." Mike looked down at his feet. "Are you going to leave?" Mr. Winterbottom asked. Mrs. Winterbottom looked as if he had slapped her. "Leave?" "Again, I mean," Mr. Winterbottom said. "Only if you want me to," she said. "Only if you cannot live with such an unrespectable—" "I said to hell with respectable," Mr. Winterbottom said. "What's all this about respectable? It's not respectable I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned that you couldn't or wouldn't tell me about any of this." Mike stood up. "I knew it wouldn't work," he said. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I have nothing against you, Mike. I just don't know you." He looked at his wife. "I don't think I know you either." I was wishing I was invisible. Outside, the leaves were falling to the ground, and I was infinitely sad down to my bones. I was sad for Phoebe and her parents, and Prudence and Mike, sad for the leaves that were dying, and sad for myself, for something I had lost. I saw Mrs. Partridge through the window, standing on Phoebe's front walk. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I think we all need to sit down and talk. Maybe we can sort something out." Then he did what I think was a noble thing. He went over to Mike and shook his hand and said, "I did always think a son would be a nice addition to this family." Mrs. Winterbottom looked relieved. Prudence smiled at Mike. Phoebe stood motionless off to the side. "I'd better go," I said. Everyone turned to me as if I had just dropped through the roof. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Sal, I'm sorry, I truly am." To Mike, he said, "Sal is like another member of the family." Mrs. Winterbottom said, "You're mad at me, aren't you, Phoebe?" "Yes," Phoebe said. "I most certainly am." Phoebe took my sleeve and pulled me toward the door. "When you all decide exactly how many people are in this family, let me know." We stepped out on the porch just as Mrs. Partridge placed a white envelope on the steps. Chapter 40. The Gifts. It seemed fitting that at this point in my story of Phoebe, Gramps called out, "Idaho!" We were high in the mountains and had just crossed the Montana border into Idaho. For the first time, I believed we were going to make it to Lewiston by the next day, the 20th of August, my mother's birthday. Gramps suggested we press on to Coeur d'Alene, about an hour away where we could spend the night. From there, Lewiston was about 100 miles due south, an easy morning's journey. "How does that sound to you, Gooseberry?" Gram was still, her head pressed against the back of the seat and her hands folded in her lap. "Gooseberry?" When Gram spoke, you could hear the rattle in her chest. "Oh, that's fine," she said. "Gooseberry, are you feeling okay?" "I'm a little tired," she said. "We'll get you to bed real soon." Gramps glanced back at me, troubled. "Gram, if you want to stop now, that would be okay," I said. "Oh, no," she said. "I'd like to sleep in Coeur d'Alene tonight. Your mama sent us a postcard from Coeur d'Alene, and it was on a bountiful blue lake." She coughed a long, rattly cough. Gramps said, "Okay, then. Bountiful blue lake, here we come." Gram said, "I'm so glad Peebe's mama came home. I wish your mama could come home, too." Gramps nodded his head for about 5 minutes. Then he handed me a tissue and said, "Tell us about Mrs. Partridge. What was she doing leaving a gall-dang envelope on Peebe's porch?" That's what Phoebe and I wanted to know. "Did you want something, Mrs. Partridge?" I asked. She put her hand to her lips. She said. Phoebe snatched the envelope and ripped it open. She read the message aloud. "Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins." Mrs. Partridge turned to go. "Bye-bye," she said. "Mrs. Partridge," Phoebe called, "we've already had this one." "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Partridge said. "It was you, wasn't it?" Phoebe said. "You've been creeping around leaving these things, haven't you?" "Did you like them?" Mrs. Partridge said. As she stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, with her head tilted up at us and that quizzical look on her face, she looked like a mischievous child. "Margaret reads them to me from the paper each day, and when there's a nice one, I ask her to copy it down. I'm sorry I gave you that one about the moccasins already. My noggin forgot." "But why did you bring them here?" Phoebe said. "I thought they would be grandiful surprises for you, like fortune cookies, only I didn't have any cookies to put them in. Did you like them anyway?" Phoebe looked at me for a long minute. Then she went down the steps and said, "Mrs. Partridge, when was it you met my brother?" "You said you didn't have a brother," Mrs. Partridge said. "I know, but you said you met him. When was that?" She tapped her head. "Noggin remember, let's see, some time ago, a week, 2 weeks, he came to my house by mistake. He let me feel his face. That's why I thought he was your brother. He has a similar face. Isn't that peculiable?" Phoebe said, "No more peculiable than most things lately." As Mrs. Partridge tottered back to her house, Phoebe said, "It's a peculiable world, Sal." She walked across the grass and spit into the street. She said, "Come on, try it." I spit into the street. "What do you think?" Phoebe said. We spit again. It might sound disgusting, but to tell the truth, we got a great deal of pleasure from those spits. I doubt if I ever could explain why that was, but for some reason it seemed the perfect thing to do. And when Phoebe turned around and went into the house, I knew that was the right thing for her to do, too. With the courage of that spit in me, I went to see Margaret Cadaver, and we had a long talk, and that's when I found out how she met my father. It was painful to talk with her, and I even cried in front of her, but afterward I understood why my father liked to be with her. Ben was sitting on my front steps when I got home. He said, "I brought you something. It's out back." He led me around the side of the house, and there, strutting across that little patch of grass, was a chicken. I was never in my life so happy to see a chicken. Ben said, "I named it, but you can change the name if you want." When I asked him what its name was, he leaned forward, and I leaned forward, and another kiss happened. A spectacular kiss, a perfect kiss, and Ben said, "Its name is Blackberry." "Oh," Graham said, "is that the end of the Peebe story?" "Yes," I said. That wasn't quite true, I suppose, as I could have told more. I could have told about Phoebe getting adjusted to having a brother, and to her new mother and all of that. But that part was still going on, even as we traveled through the mountains. It was a whole different story.
I liked that story about Phoebe, and I'm glad it wasn't too awfully sad.
Graham closed her eyes, and for the next hour, as Gramps drove toward Coeur d'Alene, he and I listened to her rattly breathing. I watched her lying there so still, so calm.
"Gramps," I whispered, "she looks a little gray, doesn't she?"
"Yes, she does, Chickabiddy, yes, she does." He stepped on the gas, and we raced toward Coeur d'Alene. Chapter 41. The Overlook. At Coeur d'Alene, we went straight to the hospital. Gramps had tried to wake Graham when he saw the lake. "Gooseberry?" Gramps said. She slumped sideways on the seat. "Gooseberry?" The doctors said Graham had had a stroke. Gramps insisted on being with her while she underwent tests, though an intern had tried to dissuade him. "She's unconscious," the intern said. "She won't know whether you're here or not." "Sonny, I've been by her side for 51 years, except for 3 days when she left me for the Eggman. I'm holding on to her hand, see? If you want me to let go, you'll have to chop my hand off." They let him stay with her. While I was waiting in the lobby, a man came in with an old beagle. The receptionist told him he would have to leave the dog outside. "By herself?" the man said. I said, "I'll watch her. I had a dog just like her once." I took the old beagle outside, and when I sat down on the grass, the beagle put her head in my lap and murmured in that special way dogs have. Gramps called it a dog's purr. I wondered if Graham's snake bite had anything to do with her stroke, and if Gramps felt guilty for whizzing off the highway and stopping at that river. If we hadn't gone to that river, Graham would never have been bitten by that snake. And then I started thinking about my mother's stillborn baby, and maybe if I hadn't climbed that tree, and if my mother hadn't carried me, maybe the baby would have lived, and my mother would never have gone away, and everything would still be as it used to be. But as I sat there thinking these things, it occurred to me that a person couldn't stay all locked up in the house like Phoebe and her mother had tried to do at first. A person had to go out and do things and see things, and I wondered, for the first time, if this had something to do with Graham and Gramps taking me on this trip. The beagle in my lap was just like our Moody Blue. I rubbed her head and prayed for Graham. I thought about Moody Blue's litter of puppies. For the first week, Moody Blue wouldn't let anyone come anywhere near those puppies. She licked them clean and nuzzled them. They squealed and pawed their way up to her with their eyes still sealed. Gradually, Moody Blue let us touch the puppies, but she kept her sharp eyes on us, and if we tried to take a puppy out of her sight, she growled. Within a few weeks, the puppies were stumbling away from her, and Moody Blue spent her days herding them back. But when they were about 6 weeks old, Moody Blue started ignoring them. She snapped at them and pushed them away. I told my mother that Moody Blue was being terrible. She hates her puppies. "It's not terrible," my mother said. "It's normal. She's weaning them from her." "Does she have to do that? Why can't they stay with her?" "It isn't good for her or for them. They have to become independent. What if something happened to Moody Blue? They wouldn't know how to survive without her." While I prayed for Graham outside the hospital, I wondered if my mother's trip to Idaho was like Moody Blue's behavior. Maybe part of it was for my mother and part of it was for me. When the beagle's owner returned, I went back inside. It was after midnight when a nurse told me I could see Graham. She was lying, still and gray, on the bed. A little dribble was coming out of one side of her mouth. Gramps was leaning over her, whispering in her ear. A nurse said, "I don't think she can hear you." "Of course she can hear me," Gramps said. "She'll always be able to hear me." Graham's eyes were closed. Wires were attached to her chest and to a monitor, and a tube was taped to her hand. I wanted to hold her and wake her up. Gramps said, "We're going to be here a while, Chickabiddy." He reached in his pocket and pulled out his car keys. Here, case you need anything from the car." He handed me a crumpled wad of money. "In case you need it." "I don't want to leave Gram," I said. "Heck," he said, "she doesn't want you sitting around this old hospital. You just whisper in her ear if you want to tell her anything, and then you go do what you have to do. We're not going anywhere. Your grandmother and I will be right here." He winked at me. "You be careful, chickabiddy." I leaned over and whispered in Graham's ear, and then I left. In the car, I studied the map, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. Gramps knew what I was going to do. The key was cold in my hand. I studied the map again. One curvy road ran direct from Coeur d'Alene to Lewiston. I started the car, backed it up, drove around the parking lot, stopped, and turned off the engine. I counted the money in my pocket and looked at the map once more. In the course of a lifetime, there were some things that mattered. Although I was terrified when I drove out of the parking lot, once I was on the highway, I felt better. I drove slowly, and I knew how to do it. I prayed to every passing tree, and there were a thumping lot of trees along the way. It was a narrow, winding road without traffic. It took me 4 hours to drive the 100 miles from Coeur d'Alene to the top of Lewiston Hill, which, to me, was more of a mountain than a hill. I pulled into the overlook at the top. In the valley, far below, was Lewiston, with the Snake River winding through it. Between me and Lewiston was the treacherous road with the hairpin turns that twisted back and forth down the mountain. I peered over the tail, looking for the bus that I knew was still somewhere down there on the side of the mountain, but I couldn't see it. "I can do this," I said to myself over and over. "I can do this." I eased the car back onto the road. At the first curve, my heart started thumping. My palms were sweating and slippery on the wheel. I crept along with my foot on the brake, but the road doubled back so sharply and plunged so steeply that even with my foot on the brake, the car was going faster than I wanted it to. When I came out of that curve, I was in the outside lane, the one nearest to the side of the cliff. It was a sharp drop down, with only a thin cable strung between occasional posts to mark the edge of the road. Back and forth across the hill the road snaked. For a half-mile, I was on the inside against the hill and felt safer, and then I came to one of those awful curves, and for the next half-mile I was on the outside, and the dark side of the hillside stretched down, down, down. Back and forth I went, a half-mile safe, a curve, a half-mile edging the side of the cliff. Halfway down was another overlook, a thin extra lane marked off less as an opportunity to gaze at the scenery, I thought, than to allow drivers a chance to stop and gather their wits. I wondered how many people had abandoned their cars at this point and walked the remaining miles down. As I looked over the side, another car pulled into the overlook. A man got out and stood near me, smoking a cigarette. "Where are the others?" he asked. "What others?" "Whoever's with you, whoever's driving." "Oh," I said, "around." "Taking a pee, eh?" he said, referring, I gathered, to whoever was supposedly with me. "A hell of a road to be driving at night, isn't it? I do it every night. I work up in Pullman and live down there." He pointed to the lights of Lewiston and the Black River. "You been here before?" he said. "No." "See that?" He indicated a spot somewhere below. I peered into the darkness. Then I saw the severed treetops and the rough path cut through the brush. At the end of this path I could see something shiny and metallic reflecting the moonlight. It was the one thing I had been looking for. "A bus went off the road here a year or more ago," he said. "Skidded right there, coming out of that last turn, and went sliding into this here overlook and on through the railing and rolled over and over into those trees. A hell of a thing. When I came home that night, rescuers were still hacking their way through the brush to get to it. Only one person survived, you know." I knew. Chapter 42. The Bus. and the willow. When the man drove off, I crawled beneath the railing and made my way down the hill toward the bus. In the east, the sky was smoky gray, and I was glad for the approaching dawn. In the year and a half since the trail was hacked out, the brush had begun to grow back. Wet with dew, straggly branches slapped and scratched at my legs and hid uneven ground, so that several times I tripped, tumbling and sliding downward. The bus lay on its side like an old, sick horse, its broken headlights staring out mournfully into the surrounding trees. Most of the huge rubber tires were punctured and grotesquely twisted on their axles. I climbed up onto the bus's side, hoping to make my way down to an open window, but there were two enormous gashes torn into the side, and the jagged metal was peeled back like a sardine tin. Through a smashed window behind the driver's seat, I saw a jumbled mess of twisted seats and chunks of foam rubber. Everything was dusted over with fuzzy green mold. I had imagined that I would drop through a window and walk down the aisle, but there was no space inside to move. I had wanted to scour every inch of the bus, looking for something, anything, that might be familiar. By now the sky was pale pink, and it was easier to find the uphill trail, but harder going as it was a steep incline. By the time I reached the top, I was muddy and scratched from head to toe. It wasn't until I had crawled beneath the railing that I noticed the car parked behind Gramps' red Chevrolet. It was the sheriff. He was talking on his radio when he saw me, and he motioned for his deputy to get out. The deputy said, "We were just about to come down there after you. We saw you on the top of the bus. You kids ought to know better. What were you doing down there at this time of day anyway?" Before I could answer, the sheriff climbed out of his car. He settled his hat on his head and lifted his holster. "Where are the others?" he said. "There aren't any others," I said. "Who brought you up here?" "I brought myself." "Whose car is this?" "My grandfather's." "And where is he?" The sheriff glanced to left and right, as if Gramps might be hiding in the bushes. "He's in Coeur d'Alene," the sheriff said. "Pardon?" So I told him about Graham, and about how Gramps had to stay with her, and about how I had driven from Coeur d'Alene very carefully. The sheriff said, "Now let me get this straight." And he repeated everything I said, ending with, "And you're telling me that you drove from Coeur d'Alene to this spot on this hill all by yourself?" "Very carefully," I said. "My Gramps taught me how to drive, and he taught me to drive very carefully." The sheriff said to the deputy, "I am afraid to ask this young lady exactly how old she is. Why don't you ask her?" The deputy said, "How old are you?" I told him. The sheriff gave me a stern look and said, "I don't suppose you would mind telling me exactly what was so all-fired important that you couldn't wait for someone with a legitimate driver's license to bring you to the fair city of Lewiston?" And so I told him all the rest. When I had finished, he returned to his car and talked into his radio some more. Then he told me to get in his car, and he told the deputy to follow in Gramps' car. I thought the sheriff was probably going to put me in jail. And it wasn't the thought of jail that bothered me so much. It was knowing that I was this close and might not be able to do what I had come to do, and it was knowing that I needed to get back to Graham. He did not take me to jail, however. He drove across the bridge into Lewiston and on through the city and up a hill. He drove into Longwood, stopped at the caretaker's house, and went inside. Behind us was the deputy in Gramps' car. The caretaker came out and pointed off to the right, and the sheriff got back in the car and drove off in that direction. It was a pleasant place. The Snake River curved behind this section, and tall, full-leaved trees grew here and there across the lawn. The sheriff parked the car and led me up a path toward the river, and there, on a little hill overlooking the river and the valley, was my mother's grave. On the tombstone, beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death, was an engraving of a maple tree, and it was only then, when I saw the stone and her name, Chanhassen, Sugar, Pickford, Hiddle, and the engraving of that tree, that I knew, by myself and for myself, that she was not coming back. I asked if I could sit there for a little while, because I wanted to memorize the place. I wanted to memorize the grass and the trees, the smells and the sounds. In the midst of the still morning, with only the sound of the river gurgling by, I heard a bird. It was singing a bird song, a true, sweet bird song. I looked all around and then up into the willow that leaned toward the river. The bird song came from the top of the willow, and I did not want to look too closely, because I wanted it to be the tree that was singing. I kissed the willow. "Happy birthday," I said. In the sheriff's car, I said, "She isn't actually gone at all. She's singing in the trees." "Whatever you say, Miss Salamanca Hiddle. You can take me to jail now." Chapter 43. Our Gooseberry. Instead of taking me to jail, the sheriff drove me to Coeur d'Alene, with the deputy following us in Gramps' car. The sheriff gave me a lengthy and severe lecture about driving without a license, and he made me promise that I would not drive again until I was 16. "Not even on Gramps' farm?" I said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "I suppose people are going to do whatever they want to on their own farms," he said, "as long as they have a lot of room to maneuver and as long as they are not endangering the lives of any other persons or animals. But I'm not saying you ought to. I'm not giving you permission or anything." I asked him to tell me about the bus accident. When I asked him if he had been there that night and if he had seen anyone brought out of the bus, he said, "You don't want to know all that. A person shouldn't have to think about those things." "Did you see my mother?" "I saw a lot of people, Salamanca, and maybe I saw your mother and maybe I didn't, but I'm sorry to say that if I did see her, I didn't know it. I remember your father coming into the station. I do remember that, but I wasn't with him when... I wasn't there when..." "Did you see Mrs. Cadaver?" I said. "And how do you know about Mrs. Cadaver?" He said, "Of course I saw Mrs. Cadaver. Everyone saw Mrs. Cadaver. 9 hours after that bus rolled over, as all those stretchers were being carried up the hill and everyone despairing, there was her hand coming up out of the window, and everyone was shouting because there it was, a moving hand." He glanced at me. "I wish it had been your mother's hand." "Mrs. Cadaver was sitting next to my mother," I said. "Oh." "They were strangers to each other when they got on that bus, but by the time they got off, 6 days later, they were friends. My mother told Mrs. Cadaver all about me and my father and our farm in Bybanks. She told Mrs. Cadaver about the fields and the blackberries and Moody Blue and the chickens and the singing tree. I think that if she told Mrs. Cadaver all that, then my mother must have been missing us, don't you think?" "I'm sure of it," the sheriff said. "And how do you know all this?" So I explained to him how Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this on the day Phoebe's mother returned. Mrs. Cadaver told me about how my father visited her in the hospital in Lewiston after he had buried my mother. He came to see the only survivor from the bus crash, and when he learned that Mrs. Cadaver had been sitting next to my mother, they started talking about her. They talked for 6 hours. Mrs. Cadaver told me about her and my father writing to each other, and about how my father needed to get away from Bybanks for a while. I asked Mrs. Cadaver why my father hadn't told me how he had met her, and she said he had tried, but I didn't want to hear it, and he didn't want to upset me. He thought I might dislike Margaret because she had survived and my mother had not. "Do you love him?" I had asked Mrs. Cadaver. "Are you going to marry him?" "Goodness," she said, "it's a little early for that. He's holding on to me because I was with your mother and held her hand in her last moments. Your father isn't ready to love anyone else yet. Your mother was one of a kind." That's true. She was. And even though Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this, and had told me how she had been with my mother in her last minutes, I still did not believe that my mother was actually dead. I still thought that there might have been a mistake. I don't know what I had hoped to find in Lewiston. Maybe I expected that I would see her walking through a field and I would call to her and she would say, "Oh, Salamanca, my left arm," and "Oh, Salamanca, take me home." I slept for the last 50 miles into Coeur d'Alene, and when I awoke, I was sitting in the sheriff's car outside the hospital entrance. The sheriff was coming out of the hospital. He handed me an envelope and slid in beside me on the seat. In the envelope was a note from Gramps, giving the name of the motel he was staying at. Beneath that he had written, "I am sorry to say that our gooseberry died at 3 o'clock this morning." Gramps was sitting on the side of the bed in the motel, talking on the telephone. When he saw me and the sheriff at the door, he put the phone down and hugged me to him. The sheriff told Gramps how sorry he was, and he didn't think it was the time or place to give anybody a lecture about underage granddaughters driving down a mountainside in the middle of the night. He handed Gramps his car key and asked Gramps if he needed help making any arrangements. Gramps said he had taken care of most things. Graham's body was being flown back to Bybanks, where my father would meet the plane. Gramps and I were going to finish what had to be done in Coeur d'Alene and leave the next morning. After the sheriff and his deputy left, I noticed Graham and Gramps' open suitcase. Inside were Graham's things, all mixed in with Gramps' clothes. I picked up her baby powder and smelled it. On the desk was a crumpled letter. When Gramps saw me look at it, he said, "I wrote her a letter last night. It's a love letter." Gramps lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. "Chickabiddy," he said, "I miss my gooseberry." He put one arm over his eyes. The other hand patted the empty space beside him. "This ain't," he said. "This ain't." "It's okay," I said. I sat down on the other side of the bed and held his hand. "This ain't your marriage bed." About 5 minutes later, Gramps cleared his throat and said, "But it will have to do." Chapter 44. Bybanks. We're back in Bybanks now. My father and I are living on our farm again, and Gramps is living with us. Graham is buried in the aspen grove where she and Gramps were married. We miss our gooseberry every single day. Lately, I've been wondering if there might be something hidden behind the fireplace, because just as the fireplace was behind the plaster wall, and my mother's story was behind Phoebe's, I think there was a third story behind Phoebe's and my mother's, and that was about Graham and Gramps. On the day after Graham was buried, her friend Gloria, the one Graham thought was so much like Phoebe, and the one who had a hankering for Gramps, came to visit Gramps. They sat on our porch while Gramps talked about Graham for 4 hours straight. Gloria asked if we had any aspirin. She had a grand headache. We haven't seen her since. I wrote to Tom Fleet, the boy who helped Graham when the snake took a snack out of her leg. I told him that Graham made it back to Bybanks, but unfortunately she came in a coffin. I described the aspen grove where she was buried and told him about the river nearby. He wrote back saying that he was sorry about Graham and maybe he would come and visit that aspen grove someday. Then he asked, "Is your riverbank private property?" Gramps has given me more driving lessons in the pickup truck. We practice over on Gramps' old farm, where the new owner lets us clonk around on the dirt roads. With us rides Gramps' new beagle puppy, which he named Huzzah, Huzzah. Gramps pets the puppy and smokes his pipe as I drive, and we both play the moccasin game. It's a game we made up on our way back from Idaho. We take turns pretending we are walking in someone else's moccasins. If I were in Phoebe's moccasins, I would be jealous of a new brother dropping out of the sky. If I were in Graham's moccasins right this minute, I would want to cool my feet in that river over there. If I were walking in Ben's moccasins, I would miss Salamanca Hill. On and on we go. We walk in everybody's moccasins, and we have discovered some interesting things that way. One day I realized that our whole trip out to Lewiston had been a gift from Gram and Gramps to me. They were giving me a chance to walk in my mother's moccasins, to see what she had seen and feel what she might have felt on her last trip. I also realized that there were good reasons why my father didn't take me to Idaho when he got the news of her death. He was too grief-stricken, and he was trying to spare me. Only later did he understand that I had to go and see for myself. He was right about one thing, though. We didn't need to bring her body back because she is in the trees, the barn, the fields. Gramps is different. He needs Gram right here. He needs to walk out to that aspen grove to see his gooseberry. One afternoon, after we had been talking about Prometheus stealing fire from the sun to give to man, and about Pandora opening up the forbidden box with all the evils of the world in it, Gramps said that those myths evolved because people needed a way to explain where fire came from and why there was evil in the world. That made me think of Phoebe and the lunatic, and I said, if I were walking in Phoebe's moccasins, I would have to believe in a lunatic and an axe-wielding Mrs. Gadaver to explain my mother's disappearance. Phoebe and her family helped me, I think. They helped me to think about and understand my own mother. Phoebe's tales were like my fishing in the air. For a while I needed to believe that my mother was not dead and that she would come back. I still fish in the air sometimes. It seems to me that we can't explain all the truly awful things in the world, like war and murder and brain tumors, and we can't fix these things. So we look at the frightening things that are closer to us and we magnify them until they burst open. Inside is something that we can manage, something that isn't as awful as it had first seemed. It is a relief to discover that although there might be axe murderers and kidnappers in the world, most people seem a lot like us, sometimes afraid and sometimes brave, sometimes cruel and sometimes kind. I decided that bravery is looking Pandora's box full in the eye as best you can, and then turning to the other box, the one with the smooth, beautiful folds inside. Mama kissing trees, my Gram saying huzzah, huzzah, Gramps and his marriage bed. My mother's postcards and her hair are still beneath the floorboards in my room. I reread all the postcards when I came home. Gram and Gramps and I had been to every place my mother had. There are the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, the Badlands. The only card that is still hard for me to read is the one from Coeur d'Alene, the one that I received 2 days after she died. When I drive Gramps around in his truck, I also tell him all the stories my mother told me. His favorite is a Navajo one about Estanatlehi. She's a woman who never dies. She grows from baby to mother to old woman and then turns into a baby again, and on she goes, living 1,000 lives. Gramps likes this, and so do I. I still climb the sugar maple tree, and I have heard the singing tree sing. The sugar maple tree is my thinking place. Yesterday in the sugar maple, I realized that I was jealous of 3 things. The first jealousy is a foolish one. I am jealous of whoever Ben wrote about in his journal because it was not me. The second jealousy is this. I am jealous that my mother had wanted more children. Wasn't I enough? When I walk in her moccasins, though, I say, if I were my mother, I might want more children, not because I don't love my Salamanca, but because I love her so much I want more of these. Maybe that is a fish in the air, and maybe it isn't, but it is what I want to believe. The last jealousy is not foolish, nor is it one that will go away just yet. I am still jealous that Phoebe's mother came back, and mine did not. I miss my mother. Ben and Phoebe write to me all the time. Ben sent me a valentine in the middle of October that said, "Roses are red, dirt is brown, please be my valentine or else I'll frown." There was a P.S. added, "I've never written poetry before." I sent a valentine back that said, "Dry as the desert, wet as the rain, your love for me is not in vain." I added a P.S. that said, "I've never written any poetry either." Ben and Phoebe and Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Partridge are all coming to visit next month. There is a chance that Mr. Berkway might come as well, but Phoebe hopes not, as she does not think she could stand to be in a car for that long with a teacher. My father and I have been scrubbing the house for their visit. I can't wait to show Phoebe and Ben the swimming hole and the fields, the hayloft and the trees, and the cows and the chickens. Blackberry, the chicken that Ben gave me, is queen of the coop, and I'll show Ben her, too. I am hoping, also, for some blackberry kisses. But for now, Gramps has his beagle, and I have a chicken and a singing tree, and that's the way it is. Huzzah, huzzah.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from HarperAudio.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.